Anyway, we have Dr. Alice Jones, and I've known her a number of years. She's a geography professor, and that kind of lends itself to all kinds of stuff, which is what Alice has done. We have had her here talking about water. She was in the biking issue for a while, trying to help not Madison County, Richmond get better about biking. That got nowhere with our mayor, but you know she has her hands in everything besides being in local theater. She sings and dances and acts marvelously. Now, lately, you've been going to Winchester to perform over there. So I hope you'll go see some of the things she's in. They're always wonderful. I'm going to let her fill you in on what her latest job at EKU is, because I can't keep up with what she does. But anyway, I think you're going to enjoy it. We had asked her originally, the program committee wanted her to talk about water, and she's like, I want to talk about creativity. I said, well, you go, girl. Whatever you want to talk about. So here you go. Come on up.
Well, and the reason that I wanted to talk about creativity was that it's been something that I've been thinking a lot about and having conversations with my 91-year-old mother, who is still one of the most creative people I know. My current title, by the way, at EKU, in addition to being professor of geography, is that I'm the director of both the Appalachian Studies program and the Environmental Sustainability and Stewardship program. And both of those really have to do, what the common thing between those is that I've been working in the issue of water quality, particularly in coal country and cow country, for almost 20 years since I came to EKU. But in addition to those professional roles, I am a serial artist. I can't help it. I was born that way, and I'm going to run through a couple of pictures just really quickly, mostly just to kind of give you a sense of the eclectic nature of my art. Certainly, there is the acting and performing, and sometimes you get to be the glamorous diva. Sometimes you get to be the pink cupcake. Sometimes you get to be the improbable fashion model. Sometimes you get to have your professional headshot taken just a little bit differently. Sometimes you get to be the wicked witch and you share the stage with seemingly hundreds of other people, and those memories become ingrained and embedded in yourselves. And I look at this picture now and I see some of those smiling children, and I can tell you where some of them are now and the jobs that they have. And this was almost 18 years ago, and so those children are grown up, and they're certainly part of my family. Yeah, you sometimes get to be the witch. You sometimes get to be sing the pretty songs like "Do You Love Me?" You sometimes get to toast the madrigals. You get to dive into history and culture and literature. This is Oscar Wilde, Lady Windermere's fan. By the way, I also did the costumes in this one. This was actually a great production. This was a bluegrass opera production called Mothers of Ludlow, which was a really interesting story because it was actually about one of the mine strikes that happened in Colorado. But it really became the forerunner of some of the mine strikes here in Kentucky that really formed the basis of the mining movement. So it's a way to embody and experience history. And actually, while preparing for this role, I learned that my grandfather ran a newspaper in Colorado that was contemporary to the Ludlow massacre, which is where the Pinkerton boys came in and basically set fire to the houses or the tents where the striking miners and their families were living. And I never knew that before. So it became not only a reflection of my own personal history and the role that my grandfather played in that, but also of this time in America's history. Here's him. Let me tell you one thing about wearing a hoop skirt that you may not know. It's really hard to go to the bathroom in a porta potty in one of these damn places. And I was actually this is during one of the reenactments out of the battlefield, and I was actually in the porta potty with that thing up like this when the cannon fire started, and the entire little thing started shaking. It was quite an experience, yeah. So, and sometimes even if it's not your nature, you have to sit and be stone quiet. This was actually at the rededication of the Berea, the tavern, and they had live living mannequins representing different eras of the history throughout the hotel and throughout the lobby, and I sat for 2.5 hours without making a noise, and that was probably the most difficult thing I ever did in my life. But then also sometimes you get to travel, and this is in Malaga, Spain, where this is actually a Roman theater from the year 1 AD, and they are in the process of doing some renovation of it and doing some archaeology. And I asked if I could walk on the stage, and the guy just shrugged his shoulders and said, of course. So that's me singing No Business Like Show Business on a 2016-year-old stage in Malaga, Spain. By the way, after I finished it, the German tourists got in. So, I don't know what that, yeah, I do know what that was, but yeah, you encounter interesting individuals, you get to embody different stories. This is actually from Into the Woods at Leeds. You get to play with people that otherwise you wouldn't have a chance to play with, but people of different ages and different backgrounds, and there I am flirting with a college student while a 12-year-old boy is holding my purse, and you can see the satisfactory look on his face. I think one of the most fun roles I ever played was the role of Sylvia in Ruthless, where I had to share the stage with this incredible 10-year-old girl who upstaged me every time she got on stage, which is a very difficult thing to do. But you know, you get to play the glamorous role sometime, and sometimes you get to be comic relief. Sometimes you get to do the serious monologue about life, the universe, and everything. Sometimes you get to be one of the pretty people, and sometimes even you get to tell stories from history. And this is actually one of my latest endeavors. I actually wrote a one-woman show about Lucy and Annette Brown, the first and second women to earn PhDs at the University of Cincinnati, who also really literally wrote the book. Lucy wrote the book on the deciduous forests of eastern North America, and that's been a great experience. Now, transitioning out of kind of the acting and performing stuff, while I was writing this play, I actually lived at Lily Cornett Woods, and that ties back to my kind of environmental past. And so as part of the practice or meditation of art, every morning I got up and I took a picture from the same point of view every day. And that was just part of the experience of being there for 24 days, living by myself in the woods. And the other thing I did is I made a whole little community of these little wire sprites, I call them. And I would take them with me on walks through the woods, and I would pose them in positions throughout the woods while I was walking in this incredible place of nature. And eventually I wrote some short stories and some children's stories based on these characters. These three little, kind of, I see these are three brothers. They're the veritable brothers, and they're kind of very Three Stooges. They do get into all sorts of wonderful fixes. These are two of my protagonists. But anyway, you know, I mean, it's just something I can't help doing. I can't imagine oh, that's Lucy and Annette, by the way, sitting on a rock, since I was writing about Lucy and Annette. But we've had other things. This is actually from my brief experience as a photographer. I took a photography class in college, pass-fail, and I absolutely loved it. And so we have that and Tree and Bondage, which hangs in my house. Sometimes art is found. This was actually a stump that we had poured concrete in to use as like an outdoor seat around a campfire sort of situation. Eventually the stump completely eroded away, but I kept the concrete because it was just, how could you not? It's just beautiful. Again, kind of connecting art with history, I got a chance to go to Barcelona, and I was just absolutely fascinated by Gaudí and his architecture. And all over the streets and the sidewalks of Barcelona are these tiles that he created, this tessellation tile. And you can see how they fit together, and they all reference things in the natural environment of that part of Spain, in that area of Catalonia. So when I came back, I did my own, based on Kentucky. Each one of those, by the way, those panels are about 2.5 feet across. But I was inspired by Gaudi to make this thing that now hangs on my husband's workshop. For a while, I was really obsessed or just fascinated with Arecibo and Carl Sagan and the Arecibo message, you know, the message that they sent out into space that still transmits that transmitted until the hurricane out of Arecibo, Puerto Rico, sending this message that, if written down and translated, tells aliens about our life here on Earth. And there you see the telescope, and there you see the sun and the planets, and you see humans and DNA, and there's all this information about Earth encoded in that. So I made it in doll tile, once about that big, and then later on I made it again with sequins and cross stitch, just because it's just a story that fascinated me. Art doesn't necessarily always have to be purely internally creative. I mean, you know, paint by numbers has its place too. I tell you what, I love the current, the growth of these wine and paint party places that really encourage you to come in and do things together, and it's social, but you walk away with something that isn't uniquely yours. You can see that I'm not a particularly good painter, but I sure as hell had a good time. This was so much fun. This was actually given to me by a young woman I actually performed her wedding ceremony, because that's one of the rules in our house. Life is too short to sort silverware. If you come to my silverware drawer, if you can't figure out which one's the fork, that's your problem. This is actually, I'm sorry, the photograph isn't very good, but it was actually a color sketch that I made. You can see a lot of these things are about memory and about memories and about experiences I've had in places that I've been. I had the opportunity to do beach patrols during leatherback turtle protection season in Costa Rica, and at one point, me and another woman were literally lying prone on the ground with a plastic bag in this hole that would clear up to here behind this giant creature, this 6-foot-long leatherback turtle, as she was laying her eggs, and we were catching the eggs in the plastic bag so that we could move them into a more suitable place on the beach where they would be protected. And just that was my personal point of view of our hands and the back of that turtle and just that experience. And yeah, it's not a particularly good drawing, but it doesn't matter because it's something that's deeply personal to me. I do fabric art. This was a kind of a fun project. I did, one of my friends is a writer, and he was having trouble with writer's block, so I made him what I called a Josh ball, because his name was Josh, and each side of the dodecahedron. But believe me, making an actual, true, geometric, 5-sided object in fabric is not easy. But each one has a word on it, so you see create, and build, and laugh, and wander, and the idea was, you know, throw it up in the air and then pick it and use that as a place, as a writing prompt. And he says he still has it. I made that about 8 years ago, and he still uses it. I also do embroidery and fabric art. This was actually one of those kit things that I probably did actually in high school, and I still have it. That then progressed me to these patterns that you can kind of put together yourself, and so that's about 8.5 by 11. This I actually did backstage during Wizard of Oz, and then later picked it up again during Into the Woods. It was just something to do backstage when I wasn't on stage. And then a few years ago, I actually started doing these miniature portraits where I would troll my friends on Facebook, and I would find pictures of them that I found incredibly inspiring, and then I would translate those into something that I can embroider. These aren't very big; they're about this big. There's one of my husband on stage as Mortimer, the man who dies in Fantastics, and you know, how can you not love that? Another friend of mine who is a professional ballerina. This this picture was actually the first time that she did a pas de deux with the man that she eventually married. So that was just, you know, it was a memory for her, but it was also then something that I got to play with. Another friend of mine got her PhD in meteor geology, and that was out of her dissertation. The picture on the left is out of her dissertation. It's a slice of a meteor, and then I did it and I tell you what was really cool about this, and this gets back to that kinetic memory, and just the experience of being an artist, is that while it was fun doing this part, what I remember most about doing this piece was the hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of doing the black. Because it was this very, very long-term meditation, if you will. So it's actually a slice of a meteor, and actually what she does is does analysis with a spectrophotometer. So this is actually, it's got a light behind it, but this actually is the slice, and her dissertation was on this part, which is called the fusion crust, where you see these distinct areas that have these spectral signatures that are very distinct, but then you have this area here where they're all blended together, and that was what her dissertation was about.
What medium?
This is embroidery.
Okay.
This is all embroidery. And by the way, specifically in embroidery, it's all daisy chain cross stitch, because daisy chain because it fills in easily, and doesn't take as long as some other types. Just to give you an idea of how I do these things, this was actually a picture of a young man who was a student here at EKU who was actually just became aware that he was gay, came out when he was in college. It was very, very difficult for him. And also but one of his mentors was on the faculty in the Department of Theater, and this is Brian on his way to his funeral. And so I took that picture, and this is kind of the process I go through. I GIMP it and use some programming, and I put in each one of those balloons a character that this young man had played when he was a student. And then he was actually moving to New York as soon as to follow his dreams, as soon as he graduated. So that's kind of my perception of the New York skyline. And that's from Bluegrass to Broadway for Brian. And he says that he keeps it next to his bed in his house. Again, this is just daisy chain embroidery. Daisy chain. And these are about this big. One of my friends is a 6'2" ballerina, which, as you know, 6'2" women do not very often make professional careers as ballerinas. But she and her husband were married in the Heidelberg Castle because he was stationed in Germany when they were married. He died suddenly this summer, unexpectedly, at the age of 59, short of his 60th birthday. And so I made this for her kind of as a remembrance of that, and put the castle and then her dancing in front of the castle. It's my brother when he became the president of Salmon Unlimited. It's one of the things we shared. And then this is the couple that I married. This is the picture that was of them, and then all of these things have special significance to kind of their own personal. And then the last set of things I'm going to show you are actually several years ago, about 20 years ago, right before we moved to Kentucky. Tommy and I wanted a way to remember our lives we've been in Columbus, Ohio for almost 7 years. We've been there for grad school, and I wanted a way to remember all of the friends that we were getting ready to leave and the new life that we were taking part of. So this was actually the top of a picnic table. So that's how big it is. And the requirement was we had to throw a big barbecue. And the requirement was you could not eat until you had placed a tile somewhere on the table. And this thing now weighs 240 pounds, and it hangs on a load-bearing wall in my house because there's no other place to put it. Why did I not know that there was an entire culture in New Orleans that makes glitter purses? I just discovered this year, and I am fascinated and totally psyched. I can hardly stand it. Anyway, just silliness. So my house used to be painted, my living room used to be painted kind of a very, very light violet color. called my mom one day and said, well, Mom, you'll be glad to hear that I actually painted the living room wall. And she said, oh, thank God, I'm glad you finally cover up that horrid purple. I said, yes. What color did you paint it? Darker purple. But these are actually her paintings. My mother did all of those paintings, and so they have a very honored place in our house on the wall in our house. Just a couple of other silly things. That's my bathroom stall. You know, a $6 rug from Walmart can also become a piece of art. You know, that's the door. We call this the mini shed of silly walks. This is where we keep our lawnmower. And even our house, so this is my sewing room, and you can see the pattern on the wall, which was created by these lovely people. And again, it was a piece of collaborative art where we cleared everything out of the room, and said the only rules were you could paint with anything except a paintbrush. So, and I have all of those memories, every single handprint, every single footprint, every single body part print is a memory and a gift from one of my friends, and it's very, very special to me. So I'm gonna end with these are some other collaborative art pieces that we've done. Again, come to our house, we're likely to stick a paintbrush in your hand or give you tile. We had fun one time making dinosaur footprints as path stones. Everybody had to come up with a dinosaur, and we made the prints out of wood and smashed them in there. We've done some mosaics like this. This was our last barbecue. So we got this deck that actually drops rather precipitously in our backyard, and we just laid all the paints out, and our friends painted this beautiful, I have to show you. So here, this is sunrise, so this is early in the morning, and then it gets lighter in the day, so this is midday, and you keep moving this direction, and and then it gets down to sunset, and then as you drop off the back end of the deck, then it's night, and of course you have to have the Death Star, and of course it's painted with glow in the dark paint, and so it is just fantastic. And I show you all of this because at the conclusion, so this is actually like a room divider that we have in our house that again everybody got to participate in, and we will do something similar at the end here. So I just have a few more thoughts or meditations on the necessity of creativity. First of all, whether I'm particularly good at a particular medium or not really doesn't matter. When the urge strikes, I just have to do it. Now, sometimes for the sake of those around me, I do wait a few hours and scribble notes and then do things later. But it's very, very rare that I go through an entire day without committing an act of art. At the very least, I'll read a chapter or two in a novel, which to me is an insanely creative act because it requires conjuring up pictures in your head of people and places and settings and creating voices for all the characters. And I really cannot remember a time when this was not just a part of me. One of my earliest kid memories, true childhood memories, and I mean real memories, not something that I learned or that I remember from stories that were told in our family or that were from photographs. I was about 3.5 years old, and I'm in nursery school. And I can see the very institutional green walls, and coming towards me is the preschool lady, and she has this yellow smock, and which was actually like one of my dad's old Oxford shirts that had the collar cut out, and they'd put them on us backwards and, button that first button so it kind of opened in the back like a hospital gown. And these smocks, the shoulder pads would come, clear down to my elbows, and the short sleeve shirt would almost come to my wrists, and the thing almost went to the floor. And I just have this memory, this that's just emblazoned in my brain of watching this woman come towards me, and I'm holding up my arms waiting for her to slip this thing on me, and my entire body is just buzzing with energy. I can hardly contain it. My solar plexus is on fire. It's just thrumming because I know that that smock means that things are about to get messy. And if things are about to get messy, that's probably arts and crafts time. And it doesn't really matter whether we're going to be, gluing pieces of macaroni onto a paper plate with wheat paste and probably eating some of the wheat paste beside, or whether we be finger painting or whatever it is we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing something creative. And I just lived for those moments. And my mom says that when I was a child, it was just, she had to run around to keep me from marking up, drawing pictures on the walls with crayons that were hard to remove. And sometimes I did anyway. And that tells me that my creativity wasn't cultivated. It wasn't a precious flower that had to be nurtured and watered and pruned and fed. Now it was a weed. It was robust and fecund and prepared to make it on the most inhospitable soil. Now, not to say that my parents didn't feed it, they did. And then we get back to the memories again because my mother liked to paint, my father was an engineer who liked to build things, and he made the most fantastic Halloween costumes ever. And my mom played the piano and sang in the church choir. And although Dad didn't play an instrument, he had the most magnificent baritone voice and the most amazing whistle you've ever heard in your entire life. And when I hear songs like, "It ain't necessarily so," I can see him in my mind's eye, and I can see him in his shop, and he's building, and he's making a bookshelf, or he's building something else, and that is just so intricately tied with my whole being and the person that I am. I took piano and gave that up early, and voice lessons and theater, and I was involved in all sorts of arts and crafts. My mom was a big one for signing me up for, a 2-day pottery class or something of that nature. And so I've made exactly one piece of stained glass in my life, and turned one candlestick on a lathe, and painted one ceramic tile, and done bead looming and embroidery and bargello and origami, and made magazine angels and probably enough styrofoam Christmas ornaments to fill a good-sized shopping mall. A botanist friend of mine recently bought a house, and she commented that she felt overwhelmed by the prospect of choosing paint colors and upholstery fabrics and the like. And she said, "I'm just not creative," she said. "My father was an engineer, and I guess I just inherited his linear, logical brain." And I'm sitting there going, that's both terribly sad, but also completely foreign. To those who neither practice art nor science, they may seem like opposites, but I would think that as a trained scientist that she would know the similarities between them. Einstein and his violin, and Feynman and his drum circles, and Sagan, who wrote creative fiction. One of my favorite quotes comes from Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is a lover of classical music, and this is what he says about the relationship between art and science. "The beauty, the majesty, the wonder that goes on at the frontier of scientific discovery also goes on at the frontier of artistic expression. But here's the difference. I can discover something in the universe, but if I don't do it, someone else will come in after me and discover that same thing. Whereas in the arts, what you create, no one who was ever born before you or will ever be born after your death onwards will ever compose exactly that same thing you did. So in that sense, art is the unique expression of the individual, whereas science is the discovery of the pre-existing conditions of nature." The words "art alone endures" are carved on the entryway of Chicago's Fine Arts Building. And reflecting on these words, painter and illustrator Maureen Temple says that regardless of the debate on the value of art and the funding art does or doesn't receive, art must be a fundamental part of who we are collectively, because art stands the test of time. For me, committing an act of creativity is both an act of learning and education and of meditation. By definition, the act of creating requires seeking out new ideas, new ways of doing things. It requires continually learning. Oh, there's nothing like the memorization, like committing a 7-page Shakespearean monologue to exercise the synapses and work the mnemonics and the kinetic association and the repetition and the commitment and the discipline to practice that over and over and over until it's nearly hardwired. But I also learned a lot of world history from theater. The class struggles of Dickensian London, from being a pickpocket in junior high in a production of Oliver. Colonialist rule, imperialism, and racism, and Buddhism, from being one of the king's children in The King and I. U.S. abolitionism, manifest destiny and the Missouri Compromise as part of a high school production of John Brown's Body. And there's where the really creative part of acting is, not in the memorization. It's into the diving into the soul of another human being, putting on their skin, imagining what it's like to walk around in their mind. Even the Wicked Witch of the West has a backstory. And coming to understand what drives a person, whether that character is sympathetic and realistic or over the top as a villain or a comic relief, that very real empathy with that person is absolutely essential for a believable performance. And I've used that practice of empathy in my real-world relationships. In the civic and political spheres, we see increasingly in our divided world this tendency to aggregate individuals into collectives, almost to the point of dehumanization. We talk about the gay community or those environmentalists or the coal companies. But when I was working as an environmental scientist and advocate in Eastern Kentucky, what helped me most in my face-to-face meetings with a judge executive or a coal engineer or a fourth-generation coal miner's wife was the ability to empathize, to see the world through that person's eyes. So I would argue that where civic discourse demands that we be civil, one of the best things we can do is we can practice that empathy at both a personal and then a community level. And if we let political discourse strip us of our human nature, we're moving farther and farther away from being a true civil society. Theater also, and music and art has brought me together with people that otherwise I likely would not have had shared experience, and those are some of the richest experiences that I know. I've shared the stage with a woman who has been arrested 4 times for civil disobedience as a protester for racial justice in Columbus, Ohio. He was going to Columbus. And a man who was a gun activist who literally kept a pistol in his pocket on stage, which was just a little disconcerting from my point of view. I've danced and sung with an attorney who represents coal companies, a forensic chemist specializing in nerve gas, a drywall installer, a homemaker, school teacher, custodian, urban arborist, professional chef, short order cook, homemaker, school teacher, fencer, Olympic fencer, 14-year-old knife maker, and the kids that I've watched grow up and that have gone from children to being pilots and paramedics and PhD candidates. What brought us together was a shared passion for our art. But what we left and what we keep from that experience is the feeling of being friends, family and family, and that spirit and that sense of community. As a meditation, creativity is a spiritual practice of mindfulness. It requires that we be in the present. And whether it's cooking or dancing or singing or wielding a paintbrush, it requires that we be in the moment, and then requires that we draw and align our mind, our body, and our spirit. In that way, focusing on doing art helps me both get out of my head and helps me delve deeper into it at the same time. And that may seem like a contradiction, but one psychology, Cismet Mihaly, has studied how creative people live and work, and he's actually identified several of these apparent contradictions that creative people share. They have a great deal of energy, but are often quiet and at rest. Tend to be smart and naive at the same time. Combine playfulness and productivity. Alternate fluently between imagination and fantasy and a rooted sense of reality. And this are both introverted and extroverted at the same time. And then this is one of my favorite, are both rebellious and conservative. Because it's impossible to be creative without being firmly rooted and internalizing some area of culture. I think that's a really interesting point of view. So, a creative life to me both embodies and cultivates many of the Unitarian core principles: the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we're all a part. A creative life is the inescapable lens through which I experience the world and interact with that interdependent web of all existence. It's how I express the fundamental experience of what it is to be human, to think, to feel, to love, to ask big questions. It's how I relate to others, sympathize and empathize with my fellow human beings at the intimate and the global scales. It's not a thing I do, it's who I am. I'm going to end with this line from Danny Kaye and hope that it's an entree to a common experience that we can share together. Life is a great big canvas. Throw all the paint you can on.